Hello everyone. Today's case out of Vermont has just hit its 20-year anniversary and it is still unsolved. And once I went down the rabbit hole on this one, let me tell you, it was deep. The case today we're going to be talking about is definitely not an unheard of case, but it's one I hadn't heard of. And it happened just a month after Maura Murray vanished, which is a case that I used to hear covered quite often, and the details in today's case are eerily similar in some ways. 17-year-old Brianna Maitland was born on October 8th of 1986 to her parents Kelly and Bruce Maitland. They lived in Franklin, Vermont, a small rural town along the Montreal-Canadian border. Brianna grew up on her family's farmland in the woods with an older brother, and it said her upbringing made her fiercely independent. Brianna was described as having a zest for life. She was a free spirit, vivacious, and was never afraid to stand up for what she thought was right. She also seemed like a very hard worker, carrying 2 jobs in 2 separate towns. One job she worked at as a dishwasher at the Black Lantern Inn, which is an upscale bed and breakfast located at 2057 North Main Street in Montgomery. This town is also only a 20-minute drive from the Canadian border, with roots in farming and the timber industry that many frequented due to it being near a ski resort. The other location she worked at was KJ's Diner in South Main Street in St. Albans City. But as Brianna grew into her later teen years, she began to grow tired of the isolated living that can happen on a rural homestead, and she wanted to be closer to her friends. She wanted to have more of a social life. So at the age of 17, she moved out of her parents' home and began couch hopping for a while. And eventually she'd move in with a childhood friend named Jillian Stout, who lived in the small town of Sheldon near where they went to school. Now, just 3 weeks prior to Brianna's disappearance, she was physically assaulted at a party by a friend named Kaylee Lacrosse, resulting in 2 black eyes, a broken nose, and a concussion. It's suspected that the 2 girls fought over jealousy revolving around a guy. Brianna actually had martial arts training. However, the partygoers would say that Brianna refused to fight Keely back as she continuously hit her in the face while inside of a vehicle. However, after this fight, Brianna's family convinced her to press charges against Keely. There was also a bad drug problem in the area at the time, which is an issue that we see quite often in rural areas when you mix, boredom that could come from not having much to do in a rural area, and then you bring in drugs to the picture and it could take off. And around the time before Brianna went missing, as I said, she had left her parents' home. She was couch hopping. She also began to kind of associate herself and hang out with a more high-risk friend group. She also started to dabble a little bit more into trying some recreational drugs with some people who maybe had some nefarious tendencies. But despite all of that, on March 19th of 2004, Brianna would end up taking and passing her GED exam after she had dropped out of high school. After the test, she would end up going to lunch and for a shopping trip to celebrate with her mother Kelly in St. Albans, a larger town 40 minutes away. Despite it being a really good day, while they were waiting in line to purchase some items, Brianna was reportedly staring out the windows into the parking lot and then abruptly told her mother she'd be right back, and she left her mother standing in line so that she could go out into the parking lot. After checking out, Kelly ended up going into the parking lot and finding Brianna. However, Brianna now seemed very agitated, kind of anxious, which when Kelly asked her, what was up, Brianna essentially just said she had work later, she wanted to get home to get ready, and that was kind of it. Kelly would end up dropping Brianna off at her apartment at approximately 3:30 to 4 p.m. And before leaving for work, Brianna would end up leaving a note for Jillian saying that she would be back later. However, once at work, Brianna's coworkers would later say that it was an uneventful night. It was very busy, but Brianna worked in the kitchen, washing the dishes. So she wasn't really out on the floor. She did her thing. No one came to visit her. She didn't call anyone. No one called her. It just overall seemed like an uneventful night. Nothing stood out. Brianna would finish her shift around 11:20 p.m. and after clocking out, her coworkers would ask her to come and have some food with them and sit and chat. However, Brianna ended up declining because she wanted to go home and go to bed because she had to work early in the morning at her other job. A coworker would end up witnessing Brianna getting into her green 1985 Oldsmobile 88 to drive home to Sheldon, which was about a half-an-hour drive from her work. And this was the last time that Brianna would ever be seen again. She would never arrive back to the home she shared with Jillian. The very next day, police would end up receiving a report that a car had been spotted backed up to a property called the Old Dutch Burn Barn. This report was made by a ski team who was heading up to the local ski resort to do some winter activities and had noticed it while driving by. They ended up stopping and getting out of their car to look around to see if anyone was hurt, and when they didn't find anyone or notice anything out of the ordinary, they actually ended up snapping some photos. And these photos of the scene and the vehicle are actually the only photos of the crash site that we have. Which is crazy to think that if these people didn't get curious and get out and look around and decide to start taking some pictures, we would never have this evidence or any visualization of the scene. Upon arrival, police would locate an Oldsmobile that had been backed into the abandoned farmhouse, which was on a rural road at 3451 North Main Street, only 1.5 miles or a 2-minute drive from Brianna's work. And upon examining the vehicle, it was noticed to have been backed into the home at a weird angle, and the rear bumper was stuck into the foundation, causing the tires to be elevated and stuck. However, there was no obvious signs of the car veering off the road and crashing into the house. We also have to note that it was the back of the car that was into the house, not the front. However, it was really strange either way because the vehicle had hit the house so hard, it had broken into the house and was stuck. So the questions then began to arise. Was it done intentionally? How did someone back into this house so hard with such force that it literally stuck the car into the house? On top of that, the car was found to be unlocked and the keys were missing. Several items would later also be noted to be inside the vehicle. In the front seat, 2 unopened paychecks from the Black Lantern Inn addressed to Brianna Maitland were found, along with a styrofoam box with food inside. A cutout image of Angelina Jolie from an article in the August 2003 issue of Cosmopolitan magazine with the text, "Angelina holds nothing back," was taped to the ceiling. Multiple cigarette butts were in the vehicle's ashtray. In the back seat, 2 red Solo cups were found, 3 cases of food items including tuna and Campbell's chunky soup were behind the driver's seat, a CD player with headphones, an ice scraper, and empty beer bottles were found back there as well. In the trunk, luggage, clothing, and other personal items were located. Investigators would not only search the vehicle, but they'd also search inside of the abandoned farmhouse to see if anyone was there. However, they didn't locate anyone. So their next step would be locating the owner of the vehicle. With the information from the paychecks, the officer ended up going to the Black Lantern Inn. However, the restaurant was closed. So at this point, the car ended up being towed because with the information that police had, they made the assumption that there was probably a drunk driver. Whoever was driving this vehicle was drunk, and they had crashed the vehicle and then abandoned it and ran off so they didn't get in trouble. Especially considering with the contents of the vehicle, there was empty alcohol containers, it seems like, in the vehicle, so I could see how they would have gone to that. It wouldn't be until March 23rd when Brianna was reported missing by her mother after Jillian ended up calling her asking if she was there. And there was such a delay in reporting because Jillian had been out of town for a couple days. I think it was at her sister's house. So she didn't notice Brianna's absence until she came back home and noticed everything was in the same spot she had left it. There was that note on the table and Brianna was nowhere to be found. 2 days later, March 25th, Kelly and Bruce would end up driving to St. Albans to meet the police at the state police barracks there and drop off some photos of Brianna. And this is kind of when the officers connected the dots and they ended up showing her parents the photos of that Oldsmobile that was backed into the old farmhouse. And that's when her parents confirmed that that was in fact Brianna's vehicle and that she had been driving it that night. A week after Brianna's abandoned car was found, police would end up returning to the area with scent dogs to conduct a canine search. Police and hundreds of volunteers scoured the fields in the area. A helicopter from the National Guard was also used in the search. Rivers and ponds were combed, but Brianna was nowhere to be found. However, additional items of interest had actually been collected in the area of where Brianna's car had been outside of her vehicle. It was noted, however, that based on the location of these items, they didn't really know how long these items had exactly been there, so they weren't able to 100% confirm if these items were related to Brianna's disappearance. However, a DNA sample would actually be recovered from one of these items. It's never been disclosed, or at least I couldn't find the information on what exactly the item was that they pulled DNA from. However, some of the items noted to have been found outside of the area of the vehicle included a broken necklace that had belonged to Brianna, a disposable coffee cup, some loose change, and a water bottle. So I'm wondering if they got the DNA sample then from either the coffee cup or water bottle, which we'll get into the whole theories and what may have happened here, but if she was kidnapped, it makes me wonder how a water bottle or a coffee cup would have fell out of the perpetrator's belongings. That's something that I can't see the connection there, but police must have something. Another very hot topic in this case is a squeezed lime was actually found on the trunk of Brianna's vehicle. It's very strange. We'll get into that. Now, Brianna's car would eventually be returned to her family, and her father, Bruce, would end up noting that Brianna's ATM card, glasses, contact lenses case, and migraine medication had all been left inside the vehicle, which are all bad signs when things like that are left behind. What stood out to me immediately is the location that farmhouse was located at, where Brianna's vehicle was found, was at the very start of her drive home from work. As I said, it was only 1.5 miles or a 2-minute drive from work. She'd basically made it right around the corner from work before something happened. On top of that, multiple witnesses would later come forward stating that they seen the vehicle there not long after it had crashed. One witness would state they drove past the farmhouse at 11:30 p.m. and they noticed the vehicle had been backed into the farmhouse with the headlights on. Another witness would drive by at 12:30 a.m. and recalled seeing the turn lights were flashing on the vehicle. Then we have the sighting from Brianna's 17-year-old ex-boyfriend named James Robitel, who had known Brianna most of her life and had actually been at the party where she had been attacked. Now, for one reason or the other, James would end up telling police conflicting stories, which sparked a lot of allegations online over the years. However, from everything I've seen, Police heavily interrogated James, and the police and the family's PI don't seem to be considering him a suspect. I could be wrong, but that's just how it seems to me. And this is because at first, James would end up telling police he spotted the vehicle at 4:30 a.m. while driving back home from a party that he had been at across the border in Canada. But then he would later change his story and tell police he had seen the vehicle at 2:30 a.m. He'd tell investigators that he pulled over on the side of the road when he spotted the vehicle and both of the doors were open, so he ended up going and closing them and turning off the headlights. He then said he looked around and didn't see anyone. He seemed to have assumed whoever had crashed had gotten help and been taken from the scene, so he ended up leaving as well. And his excuse for not reporting the vehicle seemed to be that he had been drunk and he didn't want to get in trouble for drunk driving. However, it seems like police would later determine that James hadn't been at a party in Canada at all that night, and he actually had been at a friend's house in the nearby area. Again, why he lied about this information is unknown. However, he would end up dying in a car crash in 2019. So if he was harboring any secrets, we might not get them. But what does this all mean to me? Well, hearing the first witness was at 11:30 p.m., and it would have taken Brianna about a 2-minute drive to get to the area of the farmhouse. That means whatever happened to her happened within an 8-minute time frame, or less, because that person drove by and no one was there when they drove by. On top of that, there was no indication that Brianna had any other plans that night to go anywhere else other than home because she had work in the morning. So in my opinion, she would have drove the path past that house. And as you can see from Google Maps here, she would have passed that house on her way home. So that all lines up that she essentially left work, went by this farmhouse, and something happened there within 8 minutes or less. It's a crazy tight time frame for the perpetrator to do something for her, take her immediately, and then someone to drive by and not see anything. Another thing I found odd was that the car was found backed into the opposite side of the home she would have been driving towards. As you can see here on the map where I kind of indicated where the house was, because it's no longer there on Google Maps, it was actually burned down. But she would have been driving west towards the house. So that leads me to wonder if as she was driving past the home, someone was blocking the road, which caused her to try to back up to turn around or get out of the way, and she ended up panicking and backing into the house, at which point her vehicle was then stuck. She couldn't go anywhere else, and the kidnapper was able to grab her. There had to have been some kind of struggle because there was stuff all strewn around. Her necklace was broken, so something happened in an 8-minute time frame all around there where her car ended up getting stuck into the house on the opposite side. It wasn't like she drove off the road and crashed into the house. She had to have drove past it, backed into the house. And the only reason I can think of that something like that would happen is if someone was blocking the road and she panicked, backed into the house really fast. At first, police had the idea that this was a drunk driver, but then once they got all the information on Brianna, figured that she was now missing, they kind of had this idea at first that maybe she had ran away. But that got dismissed pretty quickly on because there was evidence that Brianna didn't leave the scene willingly, and police would come out to say that they believe Brianna was a victim of foul play. Brianna's parents also publicly speculated that she may have been abducted by multiple people, stating that it would have been difficult for a single assailant to subdue her because of her jiu-jitsu training. However, if there was a single person and they did attempt to kidnap her and they had a weapon of some sort, I think they could have possibly, convinced her to get out of the vehicle or subdued her in some way then. But I can agree. I can see how multiple people would be more intimidating and maybe cause her to panic back into the house or something like that, and then, pull her out, drag her away. How on top of that, we had a very similar of sorts scene with the two mothers in Kansas that were abducted and murdered. It came the big question of how did someone stop two people driving a vehicle and make them pull over? Well, if they were ambushed or something caused them to stop, the big question always is, how do you stop someone in a moving vehicle? Around this time as well, an anonymous tip was submitted that Brianna was being held against her will in a home in the Berkshire area, which is around 10 miles from where she had disappeared. And this home was actually rented by two known drug dealers from New York, named Raymond L. Ryans and Nathaniel Charles Jackson, two names which are very notorious in this case. On April 9th, the case that Brianna had submitted against Keeley for attacking her was actually meant to go to court. However, since Brianna was missing, the case ended up being dropped. And due to this fight happening around the time before Brianna went missing in this court case, there has been a lot of speculation if that had to do with her disappearance. I read a lot of speculation online that when Brianna ended up leaving her mom in line at the store to go into the parking lot, that someone may have confronted her to intimidate her, or she may have noticed someone following her. So that is why when her mom came out, she noticed she was very anxious. And I could see how that would make sense, because I don't see another reason she would have left her mom in line to run to the parking lot and then her entire mood would change. By April 15th, Raymond and Nathaniel's home was raided by police, and a substantial amount of cocaine and marijuana was found inside the residence. Brianna was not located. However, police would end up arresting the men, obviously, and when they would end up interviewing close friends to Brianna's, they would end up finding out that Brianna was actually acquaintances of these two men. They hung out in the same kind of friend groups and parties that she would go to. And it would also kind of come out that Brianna had been experimenting with harder drugs, and she had just started experimenting with these in a more recreational way just before she disappeared. Over the years, there have been multiple unfound sightings of Brianna, such as the one in a New Jersey casino. And in 2012, police actually looked into the idea that she could have been a victim of the notorious serial killer Israel Keyes. However, for one reason or another, that was ruled out. As I said in the beginning, another very strange coincidence is that Maura Murray ended up going missing just a month prior to Brianna, less than 100 miles away from her, which is another case of a young woman whose car was found crashed and she was never found. In Maura's case, there was a rag found in her tailpipe that has brought a lot of mystery and speculation to the case, just as that lime wedge that was found on the trunk of Brianna's car has brought a lot of speculation and mystery to her case. And there are quite a few other similarities with the cases. Both the girls' vehicles were found on rural roads crashed. They were also both experiencing some sort of legal trouble before disappearing. Then we get to an anonymous tip from an older female that has never been identified. That is extremely terrifying. Now, this alleged written statement that was given to police implicated both Raymond and Nathaniel kidnapping Brianna and murdering her a week later. This anonymous woman claimed that Raymond had murdered Brianna during an argument over money that she had given him to purchase crack, and that her body had been temporarily stored in a basement of a local woman's home. After this, it was stated that Brianna's body was dismembered by a table saw and then disposed on a pig farm. However, it seems like law enforcement was completely unable to corroborate any of those claims. On top of that, Brianna's family ended up receiving multiple anonymous phone calls from, in my opinion, weirdos who claimed things like Brianna was tied to a tree in the woods and disposed of at the bottom of a lake. Just horrific things for parents to have to hear. And we hear this often happen in cases like this, where people will just come out of the woodworks and give weird statements or make strange phone calls to families. And it's honestly awful. If you have a tip, contact police. Don't go and call the family directly and then make them worry about stuff that most likely didn't happen because you heard a rumor somewhere, or because, I don't know, people are just weird. They like to scare families sometimes and just say things that are untrue. Around 2020, there was finally some sort of movement in the case when police would end up working with Othram Labs in Texas to create a DNA profile from that DNA sample they ended up getting from one of those items that we don't really know about. And this DNA profile was later submitted to the FBI's CODIS database. The cost of all of this was actually funded by Paul Holes in the Murder Squad podcast, which is amazing to see. I think that really demonstrates how important it is to talk about cases and spread the word on cases. And eventually, I think it would be amazing if we could all do something like that as well, raise money or something to be able to solve a case or get, DNA samples tested, or pay for a PI, or get, assay kits tested. Investigations cost a lot of money, and not every family has the money to fund it, which is why there are so many unsolved cases out there. Sometimes it just takes a DNA sample being tested, but there's no money to go towards that. So I think it's really amazing when we see stuff like this happen. In the end, that sample ended up being compared against 11 persons of interest. And I also seen it match DNA from a candidate donor, which is also how a lot of other cases have been solved recently, doing familial DNA testing and stuff like that, especially with like Ancestry and those kind of things. We've seen serial killers get caught, we've seen cold cases be solved, and that's kind of, it seems like what was trying to be done here. However, it was never announced who this DNA may have matched, and police seem to not have been able to determine a suspect. VSP Detective Sergeant Angela Baker, who was the case lead, said, and I quote, "It's important to note that this doesn't mean we have identified a suspect. We are continuing our effective efforts to investigate every lead associated with this case, and we constantly look for new technology advances to aid in our investigation. The use of genetic genealogy to identify the DNA found 18 years ago is just one example of how detectives continue to track down every potential lead in this case." End quote. However, when it does come to suspects, police seem to have a handful of local men in the area that they have in mind. And a close friend of Brianna's has come forward and said that she also believes that the case is solvable. However, no one's talking. The family's PI, Greg Overacker, has also been quoted saying that he believes Brianna's body is on a private property they can't gain access to, and that's the only reason that she hasn't been found yet and that this case isn't solved. So let's talk theories. The lime wedge on the back of the vehicle is something that throws a lot of people off. And it makes me wonder if it's something as simple as her vehicle was parked, in the parking lot of the restaurant. Maybe someone had a mixed drink or something, went outside, tossed their drink or tossed the lime wedge and it landed on her car and possibly froze to the back of her vehicle because it was the middle of winter. It gets very cold in that area. Or as someone who works in restaurants, you know, when you're cleaning and she was dishwashing, there could have been a lime on someone's drink or on a plate or something and it fell onto her apron or into a pocket or something. Maybe she went out for a smoke break, tossed her apron on the back of her car and it fell out of her apron or off of her apron and stuck to the back of her car. I think that's another very plausible way that that lime could have gotten there. But I've also seen theories from people that there was that takeout box in her vehicle from work. Maybe there was a lime wedge in there and the kidnapper took out the food, threw it on the back of the trunk of the car, the lime wedge fell out, and then they threw it back in the car, not noticing the lime wedge had gotten out. However, we also have to consider there was like an 8-minute or less time frame where she was kidnapped. So is this kidnapper really rummaging through her vehicle and not taking something like her paychecks, but then taking something like moving around food? It's just, I don't know. It's kind of strange. It doesn't seem like robbery may have been the motive here because there was multiple things left in her vehicle that they could have stolen. On top of that, from what I've read from locals, this abandoned farmhouse wasn't an area that people partied at because it was right next to a road, not very private to go through parties. People would immediately notice and call the police on you. Because I've also seen the idea maybe there was a bunch of kids partying there and they had lime wedges, but you know, people usually don't bring lime wedges to bush parties. On top of that, there were multiple people driving by over the night and no one noticed anyone there. So the idea of someone having a party there and throwing a lime wedge on the vehicle, that also seems extremely unlikely. But as I said earlier, I think the biggest possibility, in my opinion, with this is that it was premeditated. From all of the facts and the evidence that we do know about, I think someone may have threatened her in the parking lot earlier that day when she was with her mother, or she may have noticed someone was following her. That is also something that would make someone very anxious. And I think either way, whoever was planning to do this had followed her that day and followed her all the way to work that night. And I think they were laying in wait for her to leave work. If she did know someone was following her or threatening her, I don't know why she wouldn't have told anyone. We also have to remember she was only 17. She wasn't legally an adult at this point. I think that's a big point to remember here. She was still a child technically. Even though she was so fiercely independent, you know, she left home to go live on her own. She was working 2 jobs. She was very mature for her age in some ways, but she was also still not legally an adult. But because of all of that, maybe because she was so fiercely independent, she didn't want to tell anyone because she didn't want her family to freak out and, you know, force her to move back home. Because if you found out your daughter who left home, you know, before she was even an adult and wanted to go, you know, work and have her own apartment and stuff, which is incredibly mature. I don't think that's an awful thing. But if you found out she was now hanging out with a bad crowd, starting to get into some drugs that aren't the greatest, it's not, you know, just smoking some weed and drinking some alcohol, and now she has people following her that may be threatening her and stuff like that, if that was the case, I would be telling my kid to get the hell back home too. And maybe that she didn't want that. Maybe she didn't want to be proved wrong that she couldn't, you know, be independent. She didn't want to move back to the rural area, not be able to hang out with her friends and, you know, do her thing and live her life. Which if someone was threatening her and following her, that was definitely the wrong move. Not to blame a victim here, but if you are out there and you have something like that possibly bad happening and you have these suspicions or inklings, please say something to someone so at least someone knows. But maybe it just all escalated so quickly because she noticed the person in the parking lot. If there was a person or something seemed off, it made her have a bad feeling. It made her anxious. She didn't want to tell anyone though, so she went home, went to work, but someone seemed to have been laying in wait. Because again, with how tight of a time frame there was for her to be kidnapped, for her to leave work, drive 2 minutes down the road, and then within 8 minutes, she's vanished. In my opinion, that's premeditation. I don't see the chances of some random serial killer sitting on the side of the road there and waiting for someone to magically crash their car on the opposite way, backing into a farmhouse. The chances of that all working out perfectly for a serial killer, I think, are just too high risk, especially on a road where it seems like quite a few people travel on. It wasn't just a random back road. So in my opinion, this was premeditated. This was a planned out thing. They knew she was leaving work that night. I think they went and blocked the road by that farmhouse so she couldn't get by, which then realizing something bad was happening, I think she panicked when she tried to turn around to get around these people, and she ended up backing up too fast, backed into that house and got stuck. And then she was truly screwed because she could not go anywhere. That car wasn't going to move. She either had to, you know, run or fight, basically. And somewhere in that, there was a scuffle. Her necklace was broken and she was kidnapped. And all of that happened very fast, and it had to have happened perfectly because they were gone before that next person drove by. I also seen theories that maybe someone was in the back seat of her vehicle when she got out of work, which I think that's a little more unbelievable in the fact that that would have had to happen perfectly. But again, it's not impossible. This was a pretty busy restaurant. They said it was very busy that night, which that would mean there was a lot of people in the parking lot, maybe, you know, looking out the windows and stuff like that. So I think the chance of someone sneaking into the back of her vehicle, which also would have had to been left unlocked, is a little more high risk. And they would have had to hide perfectly in the vehicle for her to not see them when she walked by to get into her driver's seat. If she looked into the back of the car, which is another very important thing to do, always check your back seat. But if they were laying in wait when she left and then they, you know, grabbed her or pulled a gun out or something and threatened her, I don't know how she would have perfectly hit the house from the other side. I don't know. That one just, there's too many open-ended possibilities with that. The way I go with it, where someone was blocking the road, she tried to turn around and backed into the house by accident, I think that's more plausible. But again, I can be completely wrong too. I'd love to know your theories. We'll talk about that. I'll be in the comment section chatting with you all about it. Let me know if you see flaws in my theory as well, completely. Obviously, no one knows what happened or else this case would have been solved. I've also seen allegations as well that there was a second set of vehicle tracks by Brianna's car. However, I don't think that evidence was ever taken properly. Again, there wasn't photos of the scene taken as far as I know, only by those skiers that stopped and took the photos. And obviously they weren't thinking this was a crime scene, so they weren't taking photos of tire tracks and everything like that. So if there truly was tire tracks, the question is whose tire tracks were those? However, I will say those tire tracks could have also been made by someone pulling over to look at the vehicle, such as the skiers or her ex-boyfriend, who also admitted to pulling over to look at the vehicle. Now, I think we can all agree that the most likely scenario here is that Brianna was kidnapped. I don't think she ran away. I don't think she wandered off into the woods after her car crashed somehow and died of the elements. Because again, if it was that kind of crash where she went off the road, she would have hit the other side of the house, not the side she was in. And it would have been the front of her car that would have hit, not the back of her car. So I don't think it was something like that. And then she got out, it was cold, she died from the elements or something. Clearly, something bad happened here. And the motive behind her being kidnapped or something bad happening to her is, I think, one of the biggest mysteries here. Could it be because she was pressing charges on that girl and someone wanted those charges to go away? Could it be because she was hanging out with some shady people, such as those two drug dealers who possibly wanted something more from her? Could it have completely been none of those things and just have been a stranger who was obsessed with her and who had been stalking her? I think we can objectively say she was a beautiful young girl. So could someone have taken her for other things other than a drug debt, possibly to essay her or to traffic her? I think that's a possibility. One of the major reasons that people are kidnapped are for sexual reasons, unfortunately. And there has been a lot of conversation about Brianna owing a drug debt to those two drug dealers, and if they were involved, that being the motive for them kidnapping her. However, then you also have to consider how much of a drug debt could she have built up, because she clearly didn't seem like a hardcore addict where she would have been like $100,000 in debt or even $10,000 in debt to these drug dealers, because she was working two jobs. She just completed her GED and passed. She was hanging out with her family and friends, and none of them noticed anything like that, where she would have been completely strung out to the point of owing drug dealers tens of thousands of dollars. And she also had recently just started recreationally trying drugs. And I'm not saying go do cocaine or that doing cocaine is a great thing. It's definitely more hardcore than smoking weed or something, but cocaine is also unfortunately a drug that is pretty common in the party kind of scene. I mean, I've never done it. I'm a prude essentially when it comes to doing anything like that, but I have been around people who have done it, and especially in the restaurant industry, it is a little rampant sometimes, I will say, depending on where you're working. So it wasn't like she was smoking crystal meth or doing heroin or something like that, like hardcore drugs. I think there's, levels to things. And as bad as cocaine is, and especially nowadays with all of the additives and stuff they're putting in it that are causing people to die, like fentanyl and stuff, it's just very, very scary. But again, we also have to remember this was back in 2004 when stuff like fentanyl wasn't as big of a crisis. So, her trying some cocaine at a party isn't going to end her up in tens of thousands of dollars in debt, where two drug dealers from New York are going to kidnap her for drug money. Which also, when you get into that, drug dealers aren't killing people over drug money as often as you think, especially small amounts, because if you kill someone, you're not going to get the money back. On top of that, she wasn't kidnapped and then a ransom was put out. So it's not like someone was trying to get money for kidnapping her. So the theory of her owing money to someone so they kidnapped her just doesn't sit right with me. I don't see it meshing with the evidence and the information we know about. On top of that, her paychecks were left in her vehicle. So if someone had kidnapped her for money, you'd think she would have panicked and said, I have the money in the car, take me to an ATM or something, I'll go cash them. Or they would have eventually forced her to cash them in the daytime because it was night when she was kidnapped. So I don't think banks were open then. But that didn't happen. Her paychecks were left in her vehicle. So as I said, I don't think this was someone kidnapping her over wanting to steal stuff. So that's why it makes me wonder if someone was either paid to kidnap her over some reason, or if they kidnapped her for sexual reasons, it's just horrific either way you spin it and look at it. It's just so awful. This poor young girl, she wasn't even 18 yet. Not that, it matters if someone that's 18 is kidnapped over someone that's 17, but she had just started trying to create a life for herself and being independent at such a young age, and something awful like this happened to her. But in my opinion, that incident that happened in the parking lot, whatever that may have been that caused her to be anxious, is linked to whatever happened later that night. It's too big of a coincidence in my opinion. Now, I know I just talked a lot about how I don't think any of this has to do with drug money. However, there was a theory that was brought up that Brianna may have paid those two men, the drug dealers, some money in exchange for getting some drugs from them, and that these men basically took her money and didn't give her anything in return. And so we know Brianna was not a shy girl. We know that she was very much so going to stand up to anything she thought was wrong. Again, she was pressing charges on a girl that beat the shit out of her. So is it possible if these men robbed her basically of her money and didn't give her anything in exchange, is it possible she threatened to report them to the police, and so they panicked, kidnapped her, did something with her? That would also align with that anonymous older woman's story she told police. And if this had anything to do with money, I could see that being possible, especially since these men had links to New York. They probably had higher ups if they were sent to these smaller towns to distribute drugs there. From what I've seen the PI talk about, that was something that was happening. So if they were threatened, something bad may have happened then. But let's have a big chat down below, because there are so many more theories than just the ones I talked about today. I think these are some of the bigger ones I wanted to talk about. I've also seen, the theories of maybe her ex-boyfriend James did something to her. But again, it seems like police really dug into that and didn't find anything other than him lying for some reason, which also I know doesn't make sense, but there seems to have been bigger fish to fry, if you want to put it that way. The director of the Vermont State Police has said, and I quote, "We remain as dedicated to this case now as we were when Brianna disappeared. This is not a cold case, but it is an unsolved one, and we're hoping the announcement of a significant financial reward for information will help change that." End quote. And that is because they have now put out a $40,000 reward to help solve Brianna's case. So if you have any information out there, please say something. Brianna deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. Brianna's family has also created a Facebook, so if you want to go show them some support and love, I'll have that link down below. Her father writing on it, and I quote, "As yet another March 19th approaches, I ask for your prayers for Bree to be found. I set up stones from the wall where she was born to remember, but she is not there. I love you and miss you. Dad." End quote. As I said, even 20 years later, they are still fighting for answers for Brianna. And at a recent press conference, the FBI also said what I often say at the end of these videos, which is, and I quote, "Someone out there may have information that can help solve this case. It's been too long and it's time to come forward." End quote. So yes, if you know anything out there, please say something. I'll have the appropriate authorities down below to contact. I think there's a lot of things we can learn from this case. One being, if you have a bad feeling about something, if you think someone's following you, or if you're being threatened by someone, or if you've just gotten yourself into some bad kind of situation, please say something to someone. Even if it's going to cost something like you possibly having to move back home or do something you don't really want to do, it's more important than you losing your life or the possibility of you disappearing. Because as we see, this kind of shit happens way too often. I think that's something very important to talk about. Another very important thing I think is just don't involve yourself with, nefarious people or people having bad intentions. I did that when I was in my early 20s, and I am very grateful that nothing bad happened to me. Looking back in hindsight, especially after seeing cases like this, when you associate yourself with bad people, bad things can happen. And there are multiple instances I can think in my own story that I could have been kidnapped. I could have just vanished or disappeared, or something bad could have happened to me. And I am just very grateful and thankful that it didn't. And that also is kind of what led me to wanting to tell these stories and spreading the word on these cases as well, because I could have ended up like one of these girls. There was a possibility that I definitely could have, but thankfully I did not. And thankfully I'm still sitting here today and I'm able to tell these people's stories and we can talk about stuff like this. But yeah, just stay safe out there. Please just stay safe out there. There are just so many bad people out there who have bad intentions, and no one deserves to just vanish and not have answers. Everyone deserves to live a full life. And I think it's an honor to grow old. And as we see, there's just so many cases of young people who just disappear, some for reasons like they just leave a party drunk and they vanish, to situations like this where she left work preparing to go home to go to work the next day and just poof, gone. But someone out there knows something. That is the biggest part of all this. Someone out there knows the truth and knows what happens. They're just not talking. But as always, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.